Find out what's going on. Get involved. Change things from the inside. Make a difference. Take pride. Multicultural at its best. The Luisa Marshall Show. Coming up.
Today, all news simply the best. Get involved. End labor exploitation and trafficking in BC. Millions of temporary Filipino workers are victims of trafficking in Canada, US, and all over the world. West Coast Domestic Workers Association and Migrante BC joined forces to fight exploitation and trafficking in BC. In 2010, live-in caregiver Leticia Sarmiento fled her employers and fought a much-publicized legal battle against them. The result was the first conviction for human trafficking under Canada's Immigration Act. Former US Congresswoman Velma Veloria was instrumental in passing a law that made human trafficking a crime.
But there is one reported case of labor trafficking in BC with Leticia.
Watch the special highlight.
Experience of 400 plus temporary foreign workers who paid $8,000.
And a very special interview with Velma.
Murders of 3 Filipino women.
All these coming up. Hello, hello, hello. Today's show is powerful. Labor trafficking is happening every day, and unfortunately, it is happening right here in British Columbia. The West Coast Domestic Workers Association and Migrante BC have recently joined forces with Lawyers' Rights Watch Canada and the Vancouver and District Labor Council to make an awareness to fight exploitation and trafficking in BC. Take a look.
Million slaves in the world today. That includes labor trafficking, sexual trafficking, and children trafficking.
Collectively, we can be a voice to support these workers and to bring an end to labor trafficking and labor exploitation. So that is part of our goal here, to raise awareness and also to build solidarity and to take action and to take steps to end this terrible practice here in our province, in our very own province, and to contribute around ending it around the globe. Experience of 400 plus temporary foreign workers who paid $8,000. They were recruited RC in Saudi Arabia. They paid $8,000.
Philippines, Saudi Arabia, and some other parts of that. Yeah.
They paid $8,000, which is illegal, for a job in Canada. They came to Max. Now, who knows Max convenience stores and Subway, right? Those convenience stores and Subways across BC and Alberta. These 400 plus temporary foreign workers came to BC, Alberta, and guess what? No job.
No job for them.
Waiting for them. And some of them very terrible experiences. They were kept in apartments. Some of them were put into low-wage labor. They were desperate. The situation, some of them were in debt bondage because they took out big debts to be able to afford to come here, and no work. So that's an example of labor trafficking, friends, that happens in our midst here in British Columbia.
The event keynote speaker, former US Congresswoman Velma Veloria, shares important information to spread awareness.
Magandang gabi po sa inyong lahat. Naimbag arabi iyo amin na po. What a tremendous honor for me to be invited by MLA Elmore and be here with you tonight. Yes, I am the first Filipina ever elected to the Washington State Legislature in mainland USA. I left the legislature in 2004, but I continue to be active I work with an organization called the Filipinos Against Violence. It's a program of the Filipino community of Seattle. The Filipinos Against Violence program focuses on educating the communities of color in Washington state, including the Filipinos, about human trafficking and other forms of violence, providing services to survivors, working with policymakers to develop legislation to prevent human trafficking, protect the survivors, and punish the perpetrators. As Susanna said, the human trafficking movement in Washington state started with the 1995 murders of 3 Filipino Americans inside the King County Courthouse. One of them was a mail-order bride, and we respectfully call that migrant marriage. As a response to the pain of our communities, that our communities faced at the time, I was fortunate enough to be in the Washington State Legislature. And the Washington State Legislature funded a study to determine if human trafficking existed in our state, both labor and sex trafficking. When the study came back with a resounding yes, I introduced and the legislature passed House Bill 1175, making it a felony to recruit, harbor, transport, or obtain any person for labor or services using force, fraud, or coercion, including sex, trafficking, and other forms of forced labor, from the domestic servitude to sweatshop work. In Washington state, most of the survivors of labor trafficking are foreign nationals who arrived to the U.S. on a temporary non-immigrant work visa. There's a push and pull factors for foreign nationals falling prey to labor trafficking. Oftentimes, labor trafficking survivors face a dire economic situation and few options in their home countries, which make the promise of a lucrative work in the United States and Washington state a brighter future for their families, a compelling draw. But what is never mentioned are the causes of this dire economic situation that foreign nationals face in their country of origin, and why they are forced to migrate. In Canada, you have a visa that's something similar to the H-2A visa. It's called Temporary Foreign Workers Permit, Employer-Specific Work Permit. They also have an additional thing called Seasonal Workers Agricultural Program, which is SWAP. These temporary foreign workers have to be hired, and they must be citizens from Mexico or participating Caribbean nations. Why do you think that is? Like the US H-2A visa, a person who holds this type of work permit can only work for the employer for the length of time specified, and if applicable, only at the location shown on the permit. Domestic workers in the Washington and the United States. The Institute for Policy Studies and the National Domestic Workers Alliance, in a joint report, found that there are 2 million, approximately 2 million domestic workers in the United States today. They are either US citizens, an immigrant lawfully admitted or permanent residents, or an immigrant with a valid work permit. They often work for wealthy families, including international business people, diplomats, cleaning their houses and caring for their loved ones. The Philippines is the country that sends the largest number of domestic workers to the US. Of the 110 trafficking cases processed by the National Domestic Workers Alliance, the largest number of survivors involved come from the Philippines. In Washington state, we have victims of labor trafficking who were brought to the US as maids or katulongs. You know all those, right? We had 300 teachers that were recruited in the Philippines by a recruiting agency, promising them jobs, charging them more than $20,000 in fees, only to find out that there were no jobs waiting when they arrived, and they were left alone to fend for themselves. The other victims of trafficking in our state have their salaries withheld, wage theft to my union members, and they arrive at their passports and their travel documents are confiscated. So we all know that human trafficking can happen to anyone, but why is human trafficking so prevalent among Filipinos? Despite the recent economic advancement, the Philippines continue to be one of the largest source countries for sex and labor trafficking victims around the world. According to the most recent estimates from the World Bank, 26.5% of the Filipino population living in the Philippines live in poverty. This high rate of economic disparity remains one of the largest factors driving many Filipinos into human trafficking situation. The Philippines' main export is her people. Her people have become commodities to be bought and sold. 662,600 people of Filipino descent live in Canada. From 1990 onward, there has been a steady flow of Filipinos entering Canada, with an excess of about 40,000 coming in every year. Vancouver is home to the second largest Filipino community in Canada, with approximately 100,000 Filipinos residing here. Filipinos in Vancouver make up the third largest Asian Canadian and visible minority. We already know that there is one reported case of labor trafficking in BC with Leticia Sarmiento, and then now there seems like there are others. But by taking that brave step, Leticia will help others to step forward. So what can we do to help Leticia and the others? Number one, you taking these notes down? We need to educate others about human trafficking and the impact these free trade agreements have on us personally and the workforce globally. We must build coalitions that will fight for fair trade agreements, one that protects our human rights, especially the right not to be submitted to slavery, servitude, forced labor, or bonded labor. Currently, the North American Free Trade Agreement is being renegotiated. Canada is a key part of that renegotiation. Are the champions against human trafficking included in their conversation, or is it just about how much profit corporations can make? We must work with local and federal elected officials to develop legislation to prevent those who are vulnerable from being trafficked, protect the survivors of trafficking, and punish the perpetrators who do the trafficking. We must exercise our right to vote and vote for those who represent our values and those who will protect our human rights. And finally, ladies and gentlemen, in this globalized economy, we cannot fight this corporation's power alone. We must expand our coalition and join forces with the faith communities, with workers, organized and unorganized, and other community-based organizations from around the world, and continue the struggle to make this world free of exploitation and trafficking, and give all the workers the respect and dignity that we deserve. Thank you again for inviting me. It's a real honor. Thank you.
We'll be back with more highlights and a special interview with Velma. Don't go away. Velma is an incredible individual bringing to light the reality of labor trafficking and exploitation, making history as the first Filipino woman elected to the Washington State Legislature in 1992. She is also a labor and community organizer and is part of Filipinos Against Violence in Seattle. Hey, Velma! Welcome to Vancouver.
Thank you so much. Thank you for inviting me.
Wow. You just arrived this morning, right?
Yes, I took the train. It was beautiful. It was a great ride.
It's probably much better than driving.
Oh, of course. Yeah, you don't have to deal with the traffic. The site is beautiful all the way up.
Welcome to Vancouver again. Anyway, here we are again talking about a very important issue, not only to you but to the rest of the world. Human trafficking. You have been a strong advocate against human trafficking. What has changed through the years that gives victims of human trafficking hope to be rescued?
Well, number one, I introduced the anti-human trafficking bill in Washington State in 2003. Nobody knew what human trafficking was at the time. Now everybody knows. So what has changed is the awareness of people and the willingness of the traffic victim to come forward. And then in Washington State, we've actually developed pieces of legislation that will help the survivor and punish the perpetrators.
I read about you. I'm a big fan, Velma. We all know that human trafficking requires the effort of each and every one of us. How can the community help stop human trafficking? What can we do?
Oh, several things. One is that we need to build a lot of people's awareness and education, okay? The other is we need to support the organizations that are already working against human trafficking. And finally, we need to try to figure out how are we going to change the globalization of our economy so that it becomes more fair for workers, not just for Filipinos, but around the world. And I'm hoping to be able to tell you how we might be able to change that, particularly since NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, is being negotiated between Canada, the United States, and Mexico. So they're renegotiating it now, and hopefully we can put pressure on those people to make sure that we get some sort of access so that we can talk about the issues of human trafficking.
Every country is different regarding initiatives and support for victims of human trafficking. What is the best possible help for victims to recover and move on to a better life?
Well, number one, I think they need to be able to have some sort of a way to stay in the country where they are at, right? They need protection from their traffickers. In the United States, we have what we call a T visa, which is a trafficking visa, and it allows those who are trafficked to stay in the United States and then begin to look at citizenship. And then the other part too is that I think we need to try to figure out, like in each country, how we can best support. So, for example, they may need education. They may need, a friend of mine treats former victims of trafficking with post-traumatic syndrome. So there's a lot of medical help that they need, and I think those are some of the things that we can look into.
Velma, I admire you. I really admire you for your hard work, for your advocacy for many, many, many years. And you started to feel all this when you were in the state legislature.
1995 was when the murders happened in Washington State. The murders of 3 Filipino women. They were the ones who started the movement. Unfortunately, their death was the one that spurred the movement.
It's a very concrete experience to really bring it home. That it's not just in third world countries, but it's also here in British Columbia.
Especially in our own community. So we have to bring awareness.
These workers are so marginalized, right? And they're often silenced and they're scared to come forward. And it's with support from the community. Many of you, we have many activists from labor groups, from community groups, from the Catholic Women's League, from different organizations that reach out, that provide that support. We're here not only to raise awareness around labor exploitation and labor trafficking, But all the organizations came together for a very special person and a very special cause to support Leticia Sarmiento, RC. And Leticia Sarmiento is very special. We're going to hear a tribute in her honor about why we're here. Leticia was a caregiver. We're going to hear about her story, about how she's inspired so many of us to stand up and really work towards ending labor exploitation and labor trafficking. Leticia, you have inspired all of us, and we appreciate your commitment, and certainly I take inspiration from
Yes, she is, and I think she's a living example of courage. Courage because she came forward, right? By coming forward and telling and sharing her story, a lot of people were able to realize that even here in our own backyard, there is some kind of slavery and oppression that is going on. It's hard to believe, but it is there. Hard to believe.
So, thank you very much, Leticia. We're here because of you and everybody. Thank you. The funds we raised are going to go towards Leticia to get her last wishes are to visit her mother in the Philippines and also her granddaughters who she hasn't met, who's 8 years old. So we said, but whatever we can do to support you. So thank you very much, Leticia. We love you.
We'll keep in our prayers, Leticia, and a lot of people have.
All right.
We need the community to be more vigilant and see warning signs of exploitation. To help victims of trafficking, please go to the West Coast Domestic Workers Association website, wcdwa.ca. Please don't drink and drive, don't text and drive, always be kind. Let's stop bullies. See you next week. Bye-bye.